want to thank everyone for coming tonight. We are here to talk about floodplains, specifically floodplain mapping, the need to update our floodplain maps, and how we're going to go about doing that. My name, as you can see across the screen, hopefully, is Stephanie Lott with the Watershed Protection Department. I'm in their communications office. And I think that y'all cannot see, the number of people here, but we do have over 100 attendees. We had about 200 people registered, so we may have some more people joining the meeting as we go. So our plan for this evening is we do have a fairly long presentation that's, like I said, about the floodplain mapping. Then at the end of that presentation, we're going to turn it over to you for questions. So I am going to start off with some introductions. And the first I want to introduce you to is our department, which is Watershed Protection. I don't think we have quite the name recognition as the police department or the fire department. So what we do at Watershed Protection is work with our creeks and our waterways, and we work on flooding, erosion, and water pollution issues. My shorthand for that is that we protect people from the watershed and the watershed from people. We are funded principally by the drainage charge on your utility bill. I want to mention just briefly that we do have a strategic plan effort going on right now. I don't want to dwell on this because it's not the topic of our meeting today, but it is called Rain to River, and it is going to guide our work for the next 10 years. So if you have strong feelings about what you would like our department to be working on, where you think our priorities should be, that's the type of input we're really trying to get from the public right now. And I'd encourage you to go to raintoriveratx.com and take our survey and leave comments there. It's both a straightforward survey where you're answering questions and leaving comments, but there's also a map there where you can point out locations that you think need attention or that you really love. And I just want to introduce you to some of the other people who are going to be here tonight. So first of all, we have Karl McArthur, who is an engineer with our department, and he is going to be giving you the presentation, and he's been taking the lead on this effort. And then we also have Katina Borer and Jameson Courtney, who are going to help answer questions in the Q&A. And they are also with our floodplain office.
Thank you, Stephanie. And one more name to throw out there. We also have Kevin Shunk, who is our city's floodplain administrator, in the bullpen if we need him for questions. So he's also listening in. So as you are all aware, since y'all are here at the meeting, and hopefully most of y'all got a mail out saying that we are in the process of doing some floodplain studies. Your property may or may not be impacted, but you're close to a stream that we're studying. So our purpose here, we're still fairly early in the project, is to kind of give you all an overview of what we're doing, how we go about doing a floodplain study, and how the results of that study may affect you. As Stephanie mentioned, it's a fairly long presentation. I'm going to try to speak slow enough for our interpreters to keep up and yet get through it in time for us to have a fair amount of time for questions at the end. So hopefully we will accomplish that. All right. Starting off with the why of why we're doing these floodplain studies. There's a whole variety of reasons why we update floodplain studies. They can range from just simply new and better topographic data, changes in watersheds, changes in creeks and drainage systems as a result of projects and development. The driving force behind this particular study is a new understanding of extreme rainfall that we have in the Austin, Central Texas area. And that's a result of a recent publication by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration called Atlas 14. And that study included a ton of statistics on historical rainfall data, all the rainfall data that we have in Texas as far back as we can go, and including more recent events like the October 2013 Halloween flood in Austin, the October 2015 Halloween flood, Memorial Day 2016 flood, Hurricane Harvey, all those big recent events. Churning through all that data, they came out with a new atlas of rainfall. So it shows the extreme rainfall that we may expect in our area. And in the Austin area, our 24-hour 100-year rainfall, which is kind of the standard design event, went from about 10.2 inches to about 12.5 inches based on the new study. So that's a significant increase, and it will have an impact on floodplains. So we expect that they'll generally get bigger. Just a quick note on terminology. When we talk about a 100-year event, be that rainfall or flooding, we're talking about an event that has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So that means it could go 150 years between, or it could go 2 years between. It's just every year there's a 1% chance of an event of that size happening. I mentioned the 2 Halloween floods that impacted Onion Creek. That was pretty close to 2 100-year events happening in 3 years. What we did as a result of this study, we updated the city's code and drainage criteria to incorporate the fact that that new rainfall data exists. We've changed our regulatory floodplain. So if you are involved in doing any development or you're wanting to remodel your house and you're near the floodplain, we currently regulate to what is currently the FEMA 500-year event. That's pretty close to what we expect the new floodplains to look like after we're done with these studies. All right, and what we get out of these studies at the end, we get a set of computer models that we use to do the analysis and generate the floodplains. Those models we share with the development community, with other engineers, with whoever needs them, so that we can regulate development and keep people informed. Of course, we get new floodplain maps. We get a lot of supporting data that goes along with that helps us to communicate flood risk to the public. And ultimately, we are working with FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, on both of these studies. And one of the final products, probably about 3 years after we finish our studies, will be new flood insurance rate maps. I'll talk a little more about that later. And our primary goals with the study, we're not out to put more people in the floodplain because we like to do that, because we don't. It makes more work for us too. Our primary goals in doing the floodplain studies are public safety. We want everyone to have a clear understanding of what their risk of flooding actually is, improved regulatory tools so that we can prevent any future flooding problems, and then tools that we internally and with the consultants that we work with can use to evaluate potential projects to reduce flood risk. So those are the main things we want to get out of it. Floodplains do change from time to time, as I mentioned. This is a quick summary of the more recent changes in the floodplains in the Austin area, starting with back in 2005, early 2000s. FEMA made a big effort to modernize all their floodplain maps, so make them all digital. So there were a number of watersheds that were studied in that, and the entire county of Travis County was updated, and those maps went into effect September 2008. There's 2 dates here, because one is the first date is when we finished the study. The second date is when the new FEMA maps became effective. So as you look down there through that, you can see that there's a pretty good gap between when we finish a study and when the new FEMA maps become effective. So there's a gap between when we're done and when flood insurance requirements may kick in. Won't belabor the list too much. I will talk in particular about that Onion Creek study. We're talking Onion Creek Watershed here in this meeting. We completed a study in 2017, new maps in January 2020. Now we're going back and updating them again because of Atlas 14. All right, so the where of where we're studying. Basically, everywhere that there's City of Austin full purpose or limited purpose jurisdiction, and the adjacent communities that kind of interweave within our jurisdiction. Within the Onion Creek watershed, that'll include the village of San Leona, Sunset Valley, village of Bear Creek, and a couple others. City of Buda slightly impacted. But we will be restudying floodplains throughout the city. Hayes County has their own grant projects ongoing to update floodplain studies. Up in the north of our area in Williamson County, they also have some federal and state grant money. They'll be doing studies to update the floodplains up there as well. So basically, we're doing everything but updating the Colorado River, which includes Lady Bird Lake and Lake Austin, because Atlas 14 didn't have a significant impact in the upper Colorado basin, which, of course, the Colorado through Austin is controlled by Lake Travis and Mansfield Dam primarily. So that one is not changing. Quick overview of how we're breaking out the studies and what they cost. As I mentioned, we're talking Onion Creek Watershed today. That is broken into 2 studies. So we have 2 consultant teams doing projects that they're interrelated. They have to work together to finalize that because it all comes together in the Onion Creek main stem. In the remainder of the city of Austin and adjacent communities, we have 5 study teams. So we'll be breaking that into 5 studies. The overall cost of these studies, about $19 million. And that's split out between grant funding that we're getting from FEMA and the Texas Water Development Board, and funding through the drainage utility fee. All right, so zeroing in on the Onion Creek Watershed. The Onion Creek Watershed in its entirety is about 350 square miles, includes the Williamson Creek watershed, Slaughter Creek, Bear, Renard, Marble, lots of tributary watersheds. It basically covers almost the entirety of the south side of Austin, south of State Highway 71. We've got a little bit more in Dry Creek over southeast of Onion, and that'll be studied with the rest of the studies. So getting back to that previous Onion Creek study, and again, why we're restudying a watershed that we've at least partly restudied fairly completely, or fairly recently. And again, the main reason is that new understanding of extreme rainfall in the area. So we're going to reevaluate what we previously studied and add a fairly significant amount to the study. A little visual of that. If you can see the blue streams there, that is what we studied in 2017. So as you can see, it's just the Onion Creek main stem, a little bit of Bear and Little Bear, and the Renard watershed. For this study, we're studying the whole thing that touches City of Austin jurisdiction. Those numbers and shaded areas in the back, those are the city council districts. If you're curious, districts 2, 3, 5, and 8 are impacted by parts of this study. Also, the study will include some streams that have not previously been studied. So in addition to what we already have floodplain maps for, we're going to take our studies out to the point at which there's 64 acres draining to a stream. And that goes along with our floodplain regulations that go up to that 64 acre point. So we'll be restudying the floodplains we have, and there will be newly mapped floodplains in those red areas that you see on the map. Those areas are already floodplains. They're just not currently mapped. So these studies will add those. So how do we go about doing these studies? We've got a really good video up on our website, our study website, that I'll talk about here in a minute, that'll walk you through in a little more detail than I'll probably go through here, what all is involved in the study, and talk a little more about what we do it. The floodplain study has 4 major parts. First off, survey. That encompasses both on the ground, in the field survey of bridges, culverts, creek channels, and also incorporation of aerial topographic data. So we're taking the latest, greatest data that we've collected in cooperation with the state for aerial topography, combining that with actual field survey to give us the best picture we can get of what our creeks that we're studying look like. Second part, hydrology. That's figuring out how much water gets to the creek. So we have rainfall, falls on the watershed, then it's got to flow overland or through storm drains into the creeks and ultimately into the streams that we're mapping. That leads us to the next step, hydraulics. So with that, now we know how much water gets to the creek. We need to figure out how high in the creek that water is going to get. So we have computer models that figure out the hydrology, then computer models that figure out the hydraulics, and that leads finally to the mapping. So once we've done the hydraulics, there's tools that allow us to map where the water goes once it gets outside of the banks of the creek, and that gets into the floodplain and where we start having buildings and houses impacted. So those are the major parts of the study, and we'll go through where those fall on our schedules for our studies here in a few slides. Talking a little more about some of the products that we get out of this, talking fully developed floodplains versus FEMA floodplains. So within the city of Austin, we use two different types of mapped floodplains. FEMA floodplains, which are based on the current conditions within the watershed, current levels of development, everything as it exists today. And those are the maps that are used to establish flood insurance requirements. So we map that, and then we consider fully developed conditions. So we take the watershed as it is now and fill in whatever is undeveloped within the watershed to come up with a picture of what the floodplains may look like in the future. And that's what we base our floodplain regulations on, our development regulations. So if you are developing anything, remodeling your house, and need to deal with floodplain issues, we'll be basing that on the fully developed condition floodplains. A note on timing in relation to those two, and I'll talk about this more when we get to the schedule. We'll go through the studies, we'll produce our computer models, we'll produce our maps, we'll internally accept those as the city, and then we'll submit them to FEMA. So once we've accepted them as the city, we'll start using them for regulatory purposes. If any of you are familiar with our FloodPro website, and I'll talk more about that later, that shows the regulatory floodplains. The city has a property profile web map tool that's also very handy. You can turn the floodplains on there. When you show the fully developed floodplains, that's the ones you'll see there. And those existing condition floodplains, we submit to FEMA. They'll take them, produce a flood insurance rate map, which is what you see on the side of your screen there. That'll take somewhere between 2 and 4 years after we're done with our study. And when those are published, that's when flood insurance requirements would kick in for any newly mapped areas or expanded floodplains. One other thing I wanted to mention in the way we do the studies and the way we consider flood risk, and that's flooding from creeks, which is what we're focused on today, and also localized flooding. So our floodplain maps are showing the water that spills out of the creeks into the floodplain. And when we talk about localized flooding, we're talking about the flooding that occurs as water is trying to get into the creek. The image you see on the screen is called the Guadalupe Storm Drain System. It's in the Waller Creek watershed, Guadalupe Street, 38th here, or 35th. If anybody's ever gone to see the Christmas lights on 37th Street, that's in that area. But we have a lot of issues because our storm drain system isn't big enough. So we have some flooding in those areas. So that's not part of what we're doing here. We have another effort to look at those areas, and we look at those both on a study by study basis, and we're going to be looking at them more programmatically. But we don't currently regulate to those delineations where there's not an open channel. So there won't be any flood insurance requirements in those kind of areas once we get further into doing those. Examples of some floodplain changes. The rainfall amounts are getting bigger, so we expect the FEMA 100-year floodplains to get bigger. I also talked about how we're currently using the FEMA 500-year floodplains as our regulatory floodplain because it approximates what we expect to get out of these studies. Generally, we expect those FEMA 500-year floodplains to be comparable to or a little bigger than the results that we're going to get out of this study. It can vary from place to place. Some areas it will get a little bigger, but generally we expect them to be similar or slightly smaller than those FEMA 500 years. And again, as I mentioned, there's going to be areas included in this current round of mapping that have not previously had a mapped floodplain. Again, there's always been flood risk there. It just hasn't been mapped. And then I'm going to go through a series of maps for a particular portion of Williamson Creek, the middle portion of Williamson Creek. That's primarily because we have an ongoing study with fairly recently completed models for that area. So I can show what it may look like as a result of our study. So starting off with just showing you how floodplains can change over time. The initial floodplain maps for the city of Austin were finalized in 1981. This is picture of the middle portion of Williamson Creek with those 1981 floodplains. And you'll see the floodplain changes a little bit back and forth as I will go through the next few slides. In 2000, there was a fairly significant floodplain study update that included Williamson Creek. So that's what it looked like based on that 2000 set of maps. Then the MapMod study that I mentioned in 2008, that's what the 100-year floodplain looked like. This is our current regulatory floodplain. So that is the equivalent to the current FEMA 500-year floodplain. And then this is the floodplain from the ongoing Middle Williamson study. As you can see, some places it's going to get a little smaller with our new study. Some places it might get a little bigger based on newer, better models, topographic data, and study information. On to timeline. We have 7 total studies, 2 of them ongoing right now for the Onion Creek watershed. So this is the schedule specific to those 2. As I mentioned, we're still early on. We've got field survey completed for a lot of it. We've got a fair amount of the modeling ongoing or near completion. It'll be a while before we have preliminary map products to show anyone. So one of the questions we've gotten a lot after we sent out our 42,000 plus mail outs for the Onion Creek area was, am I in the new floodplain? So we don't have the new floodplains yet to show you. We will have another set of meetings when we do, and we'll go over the preliminary floodplains at that point. And then once the study's all done, we'll have another set of meetings at the end of the study to talk more about what do these new maps mean to everyone. And then for the remainder of the Austin area, the other 5 studies outside of the Onion Creek watershed, we're even earlier on in those. We expect to get those studies going within the next couple of months. And you can see the timeline there with preliminary maps, hopefully in spring of 2025. And then we'll be finished up sometime not too long after that. And then it'll probably be on the order of 3 years after our studies are complete before we have new FEMA maps. All right, I mentioned that we have a website for our floodplain studies, and we'll have the link to that here in a minute on that website. And I think I saw this going through the questions earlier. There's a map that you can type in your address. It'll zoom in. It doesn't show any floodplains. It shows the streams that are going to be studied as part of our study. So when you zoom into that map, if you see a blue stream, that's a stream that has already got a floodplain that we're restudying. And if you zoom in and see an orange stream, those are the streams that do not currently have mapped floodplains. We'll be doing a study. We will be showing a mapped floodplain for those streams. And another thing that I mentioned that's on our study website is a video that does a pretty good job of explaining what a floodplain study looks like, provides a lot of information about studies, flooding in Austin, information about flood insurance concerns, a lot of good stuff in that video. So I do encourage you to go check it out. And now we've got new maps. How might that affect you? I mentioned up front that our main concerns are flood safety. We want you to be aware of flood risk. We're not doing this in an attempt to burden anybody, but we want to inform you of what your flood risk really is. And then it allows us to, with our development rules, with those new maps, to better ensure that new problems aren't created through development. And then, of course, flood insurance. I know that'll be a big concern for lots of folks. The new maps, once FEMA publishes the flood insurance rate maps, will be what's used to determine whether or not you would have to have flood insurance. So if you have a federally backed mortgage for your property and you are in a mapped floodplain, your lender will require flood insurance. We're early in the studies. There's plenty of time for you to ponder that. And then as we get along into having some preliminary floodplains, be able to look at that, and you'll have time before that to consider whether you need or want to get flood insurance. And again, we're looking for a better understanding of flood risk and to give ourselves tools that we can use to help reduce that flood risk. Flood safety and preparedness. This goes along with what our Homeland Security and Emergency Management Department suggests, having a plan. So part of what we're doing is giving the public the tools to see whether or not they're in a floodplain. If they are, then give them the opportunity and resources to come up with a plan for what to do in the event of flooding. If you want to find out if you're in the current floodplain, that www.atxfloodpro.com is the website to go to. You can type in your address, it'll zoom into it. You can see whether or not you're in the current floodplains. And for flood insurance purposes planning, we would recommend the floodsmart.gov website. They have a lot of good information. You can always talk to your flood insurance agent about that as well. Second step, make a kit. So if you know you're at flood risk, significant flood risk, you may want to be prepared in the event of flooding to have the essentials that you need if you need to leave your home, and that you have your important documents available in such a case. Stay informed. There's a lot of tools out there to stay aware of what's going on with the weather. If you go to our atxfloodsafety.com website, we have links to lots of sources of information, one of them being the warncentraltexas.gov. On that site, you can sign up for weather alerts and all hazard alerts. And we would certainly encourage you to go there and do that so you can be informed of what's going on. And we also have our atxfloods.com site that shows when we close low water crossings, and that includes the city of Austin, Travis County, and lots of surrounding counties. There's lots of information there. And the last thing they emphasize is know your neighbors. Always good to be aware of who's around you. So if they can help you, you can help them. You can keep each other informed. Like I said, we'll talk about that, all of this kind of stuff more in the third series of meetings for these floodplain studies. Regulations and developments. We use these floodplain maps and models as tools to help ensure that there's not going to be new flooding problems in the future in our permit regulations, and looking to minimize any potential future impacts to the community. And again, flood insurance. Note that most homeowners and renters policies do not cover flood insurance. You have to have a separate flood insurance policy. There's something called a newly mapped policy that can help you lock in a bit lower rates early on. Those rates will ultimately increment to the full insurance rates. FEMA has just implemented a new process for determining flood insurance rates. I would certainly encourage you to talk to your insurance agent about those. And if you don't have an insurance agent, that floodsmart.gov website can help you find one. So this was the timeline for our Onion Creek study. There was a question on when can we expect to see preliminary maps. So that was spring 2024. It may be a little earlier, but sometime in that ballpark. Like I said, we'll have a second set of meetings when those are available. I imagine we'll send out another mass mailing to announce those meetings. If anybody through this process gets on our email list, we'll be certainly announcing it there. So we'll try to get the word out as broadly as we humanly possibly can to when we'll have that second set of meetings, and you'll be able to see the preliminary maps. We'll probably try to get them up on our study website in some form. We'll have to do some more internal thinking about that, but we'll want to make them as available as we can. Tied to that, somebody had asked about, is there an appeals process? So for the FEMA process, there is definitely a formal appeals process. For our internal study process, we'll certainly take whatever input that you give us when we have that second round of public meetings and consider it as we finalize our maps. Once it goes to FEMA, they'll do their thing, do all that they need to do to produce the maps. It's a very long bureaucratic process. Part of that process includes an appeal and comment period. So you can make formal comments and appeals on the maps during that period. And that's probably for this study going to be sometime 2026 and after. And what an appeal is it needs to have some engineering backup to it for a formal appeal of the maps. Comments can be a little less formal. We'll provide more information about that process once we get closer to it as well.
I did see a comment about people having trouble with volume. That may be an issue on your computer where you need to increase the volume on your computer. But let's go ahead to our first hand up.
Hi, my name is Sanjay Patil. Can you please go to slide number 18? So one of those blue lines, those I understand it, like those floodplain maps are already there. Are you saying that those will be updated with your study?
Yes, that's correct. And the floodplains will likely get a little bigger.
Okay, so this is how do you, I went to that ATX flood website. Mm-hmm. And there are two colors. One is like a sort of light blue and dark blue, I guess. So which one is a 100-year floodplain? And so there are two colors, right? Like 100-year and 500-year floodplain, correct?
No, on that one, we're not trying to show the 100 and 500-year. That one we are showing. So that one, you can see blue and orange lines here. So the blue lines are the ones that already have floodplain maps. The orange lines are the ones that don't currently have floodplain maps, but that we will be mapping as part of this study. So if you want to see what's 100-year, 500-year FEMA, and then the regulatory ones, you would need to go to our floodpro.com website.
Yeah, so that's where I am. That's where I am. But there are two colors. One is a sort of bluish color, and one is a light sky color. So I'm wondering which one is 100 and which one is a 500.
So if you're looking at the FEMA floodplains and it shows there's FEMA option, the inside darker one is going to be the 100. The outside one will be the 500.
And Karl, if he's looking at the City of Austin fully developed floodplains.
So that one is going to be the City of Austin. I
think that's the default setting. So that may be what he's looking at.
So the City of Austin uses the 25-year and 100-year fully developed conditions for our regulatory purposes. Because of Atlas 14, until we have these floodplain studies done, we're using the fully developed 100-year to represent the Atlas 14 25-year and the FEMA 500-year to represent the Atlas 14 100-year. So when you're looking at the fully developed conditions, that's the regulatory 25 and 100-year floodplains. That would be referenced.
Can I ask one more question? If the property is in ETJ, where TNR has a jurisdiction and not the City of Austin, they control the FEMA and residential permitting, right? Because you don't have a jurisdiction there. It's in ETJ. And Correct. If the permit has a BFE that is already given to me, will that base flood elevation, that means the finished floor elevation, would that likely to change with these new studies then?
Yes, the base flood elevation is likely to change, to get slightly higher as a result of these studies.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
That brings up another question that somebody had put in the chat and had been prompted in our internal one, and that's coordination with other entities, specifically Hays County in the question. And we have been coordinating with Hays County and will continue to do so throughout the study to marry up what we're doing with what they're doing with their contractor for their study. I think they're a little further behind us in getting started. The same applies to Travis County. We're coordinating with them. All the communities I mentioned, Sunset Valley, San Leona. When you get into the other watersheds, we'll be coordinating with Round Rock, Pflugerville, Manor, Lakeway, all the various communities, and also with Williamson County. We are coordinating with them in the study that they are doing that impacts the northernmost portion of Austin.
Hi, thank you for doing this. I have a question. FEMA already started implementing the Risk Rating 2.0, which is a flood insurance tool that adjusts the flood insurance premium for residents. And I guess my question is, what is it that we can do in order for FEMA to do any premium adjustments, because they are basing their flood insurance premium based on the creek overflow, my understanding. And we don't get flooded by the creek. We get flooded by localized flooding, which is the water that doesn't get to the creek, in a reasonable amount of time. And it's flooding homes. Most of us are getting flooded by localized flooding, not by the creek. So the Risk Rating 2.0, I don't see it as a tool that is equitable the way that it says, because it's just not. So, and everybody just keeps turning me down in any advocacy that I have for monthly premium or by any insurance help out there. Okay. Not Congress, not Senate, not FEMA. They all turn me down.
First off, reference back to that map that I showed about localized flooding.
Right.
So the city is got another potential project to help more comprehensively map for our internal planning purposes and for risk communication, those localized flooding areas. We will ultimately, several years down the line, have that kind of information available. FEMA may ultimately decide to incorporate that kind of information into their regulatory model. Not certain, and I'm certainly not an expert on Risk Rating 2.0, but they definitely use a different way of determining risk and insurance rate for policies there. If you are in an area that floods due to localized flooding and not in a mapped floodplain, under the previous system, there was something called preferred risk policies. That has gone away with risk rating 2.0. But if you're not in close proximity to a creek, your insurance rates, if you want to get flood insurance in those areas, I would hope would be as low as they could be. So hopefully the system, if you're not in a mapped floodplain, but you are at risk of flooding, you can certainly get flood insurance. And hopefully those would be as low a rate as is available because it's not in close proximity to a stream. So I don't know if that fully answered your question, but it may be about as good as I can do on the risk rating 2.0 side of things.
The thing is that, for example, my flood insurance increased from $450 to $1,893. That's from last year to April. In April the 1st, when I tried to get it, they had already increased it due to the risk rating 2.0, which it's drastically increased because I let my flood insurance lapsed. So if residents let their flood insurance lapse, FEMA immediately or automatically increase the flood insurance to the highest level, because if you don't let it lapse, it'll increase slowly until they meet that gap. And I can't remember the gap thing. I think it was 18%.
I think that's correct.
So yes. It increases drastically if you had lapsed your flood insurance. If you didn't, it'll increase slowly until you get to the 18% gap.
And that's why I mentioned at some point in the presentation about the areas not previously mapped. So if you go ahead and get flood insurance before the new maps become effective, potentially lock in that lower rate, as she mentioned, and then it would increment in 18% increments up to the full actuarial rate that they would ultimately charge for flood insurance, or that they would charge if you got your policy brand new after the fact.
We do want to mention that the flood insurance is a federal policy that's administered by FEMA. So, here at the City of Austin, we don't have all the details about it, and we certainly don't have any control over it. So, we're trying to provide you the information that we have, but definitely FEMA is the place, or your insurance agent is the place to go for that. We'll do our best to explain what we can.
So I really appreciate the meeting tonight. It seems like we're talking a lot about Atlas 14, and we're talking a lot about the Onion Creek watershed and the study that was done and the future study. But, I want to talk about what I think is kind of an elephant in the room in terms of this entire area of Williamson Creek that's now going to be focused on more clearly, because Williamson Creek originates within the full purpose jurisdiction of the City of Austin with a few tributaries. And then, that origination point is very near the whole Oak Hill Parkway project. And there were so many years of community engagement by TxDOT and CTRMA. So this does have a lot to do with coordinating with other agencies. And there was some trade in hands of who was overseeing that. But it didn't really ever seem like the City of Austin was seen as a full partner in that. And I know that late in the process, the city passed a resolution to work with the other entities, and I wasn't able to follow that because of family illnesses. So I'd like to know what, if anything, was accomplished in that coordination, and whether there was any impact on addressing the adequacy of the drainage and retention and detention related to the Oak Hill Parkway. And when I talk about that, I want to emphasize that the community very respectfully requested that project maintain more of a parkway feel in size and scope. But in the end, Oak Hill is having 12 to 14 lanes of concrete laid on top of it in proximity to not only the origin of Williamson Creek within the city of Austin, but also right at the crossing of Williamson Creek in the middle of that project. And in West Creek, we have not only localized flooding, but we do have increased creek flooding. We've all noticed an increased velocity, and seeing this project now underway is really quite concerning. So I think it boils down to two questions. One is there any positive news from the coordination? Were there any upgrades to the drainage plans? And then the other is that while the city has been working to come up with some rather expensive options for Middle Williamson Creek, such as buyouts, and one that I thought was very promising and intriguing was the potential to do a bypass under Stasny Lane. It seems like we need to address where that water starts from in order to make sure that any of those expensive efforts are adequate.
The city of Austin can't enforce its regulations on TxDOT. They do generally, most of the time, do a pretty decent job of coordinating with us, and they have been doing a good job of coordinating with us on the Oak Hill Parkway project. So I switched back to the kind of study area map. We're talking Williamson Creek. Hopefully y'all can see the little arrow of my cursor. That's the Williamson Creek watershed up at the top portion of Onion. And there's Highway 290 running out that way. So that's where the Williamson Creek Parkway project is. Through that coordination with TxDOT, one of the things that they are doing is building 2 large detention ponds in this area that are the purpose of which is to ensure that there isn't an increase in flow as a result of the Parkway project. Once those are constructed as part of the project, there shouldn't be flow increases in the main stem of Williamson.
I did attend a lot of meetings, and I'm aware of those 2 large ponds, but they seem to be at the top of the project and not at the point where the project is going to significantly potentially drain right into Williamson Creek.
That's true, but holding back a lot of water up there helps down where the highway will ultimately contribute to Williamson Creek.
Well, I appreciate that. My husband and I were original owners, and I've been in the house for a long time. And it's just a very scary looking proposition to see all of that happen. And, there was very little actual discussion on flooding and water retention. There were a lot of focus on aesthetic things, but I know that was not within the city's purview. And so, again, I appreciate the time.
Yeah, our primary discussions with them have been flooding and water quality related, certainly. Another benefit of the project from a flood risk perspective is that they will be elevating the old Bee Cave Road crossing, which is a terrible low water crossing. We have flashing lights and gate arms there currently. That will be lifted up out of the floodplain, and that at least will be much safer.
I have property within the Williamson Creek project deal there. It's right there between 290 and William Cannon. It's been in my family for over 70 years. My grandfather actually donated the baseball fields there and all that greenbelt space back there behind Williamson Creek. That was all his ranch, prior. I mean, he sold that and did all that in the 70s, but I still have some property right there on McCarty Lane. Does this study take into account that is over the Edwards Aquifer recharging zone, and there are huge caverns there. And so once the water gets to a certain height, it dumps straight into those caverns. I mean, we used to sit there on my grandfather's, back porch, and it looked like the water was going to come up and it just dropped straight down. I've walked my property after the biggest rains. 2/3 of my property is in the 100-year floodplain. Every time it rained, I walked that property, and there's never any debris or anything where the waters came up there. I just want to know, are y'all studying that?
We do try to incorporate that kind of information where we have it and we can. With our modeling, we go through what we call a calibration process. Right. So we do have flow measurement locations in cooperation with the U.S. Geological Survey at a number of locations in the watershed. So we will look at historical events and try to match up our models as well as we can to those. For some other ongoing projects, we've been looking specifically, and our consultant who's working on that portion of the watershed has been looking at the effects of the recharge zone, specifically in the Williamson Creek tributary. Name is escaping my mind at the moment. There's a tributary that's almost exclusively over the recharge zone, and it definitely has some impact. So we are.
That was my question, because it's never flooded there, and it's that property's been under the 100-year floodplain for a long time, and there's a daycare there that now occupies my grandfather and grandmother's home. From way back then, I spoke to her. She said she's having problems, adding on and stuff. And I had asked her if it ever flooded. She's been there over 35 years, and she said it's never even came close.
Yeah, I know in October 13 of 2013, before the Halloween flood, we have what we call the Forgotten Flood, which was basically 2 25-year rainfall events back to back. There was significant flooding of the ball fields and things in that area. So if
the baseball fields flooded, but because they were sitting right on the thing, but her house, she said it didn't flood. And I mean, my property's right next to it. And that's actually where the aquifer is. The aquifer is not under the recharging zone. It's not under the baseball fields. It's under all that property that runs to the right of it.
And like I said, we'll try to take that kind of information into consideration as much as we can in the study. And if you have documentation of anything, you're certainly welcome to provide it to us, and we'll try to consider that too. We're looking to show what the flood risk is to properties that are impacted by creeks with this study. As part of this study, we will not be looking at potential flood risk reduction projects or improvements. That will come later in other studies that are done by the department. There are a lot of flooding issues in Austin. We're trying to evaluate as many of them as we can. We can't necessarily fix them all. You mentioned a bridge over the creek. If it's a private property, we wouldn't go in to do any kind of improvement like a bridge. It's possible that we could consider doing something in the channel to make the flood conditions better. We have done that before. Buyouts and detention or other options that could be looked at with the products of this study. We're doing the mapping, producing the tools that can be used later for flood risk reduction projects.
Thank you. We do have one question in the Q&A that we wanted to tackle out loud. It's from Joe Tully, and is the floodplain impacted by the significant amount of development?
To a degree. The City of Austin has regulations that require development to provide detention to compensate for the impervious cover that they're adding. That has in general been fairly successful. We did not have those rules until starting into the 70s and early 80s. So development built before then may or may not have detention. So it's a yes and no kind of question. The goal of our development rules is to ensure that we're not seeing increases in the flow in the creeks as a result of development. And they generally do a fairly good job of that. Obviously, there can occasionally be some unintended consequences, but generally they do a fair job of that. Another thing to consider, when we did that previous Onion Creek study, we looked at what happens if there's no development at all in the Onion Creek watershed. We ran that scenario through our models, then ran the scenario with development. The flows are not as different as you might think. Once the ground becomes saturated, and with 12.5 inches of rainfall, the ground is generally going to get saturated. It starts to behave very much like impervious cover once it does get saturated. So the really big events in the big watersheds, development certainly is a factor, but it's not as big a factor as you might think, especially where there have been effectively enforced detention rules.
I live behind Ditmar Recreation Center, a wonderful little park. And I guess that's South Bogey. I guess it doesn't matter. I've never really known the name of the creek. But I'm looking at the Flood Pro map right now in my house. And I noticed there's some light golden and dark golden lines, that are outside of the creek area. And I'm wondering, are those the lines that map the water that collects on the streets or, from rainfall that's heavier? I presume that's like an elevation type map. but it doesn't say.
I mean, there's contour lines that you can turn on that show what the ground elevation is. Maybe what you're showing there. I think that shows up yellow now.
Yeah, it's yellow. Well, it's lines.
And
it's in like every neighborhood, it looks like.
Yeah, that's probably the contour lines. I'm not a big fan of that yellow color for those overwhelms things, but does
that indicate that there's been, high waters there?
No, that's representing what the ground elevation is. So if you look on that contour line, say it's 605, that's the elevation of the ground above sea level along that contour line. So like I said, we don't currently have maps available of localized flooding.
Yeah.
We've done a number of studies, hopefully leading toward improvement projects. The Guadalupe project that I had the slide of is one of those where we do have some of that mapping for individual areas. And we do intend to produce that kind of information more broadly and make that more readily available. We just don't have it quite yet.
Okay. That would probably just be coming. And then like my house is not that, I got a letter and I'm not really sure why, but I'm 2 houses away from one of the creek areas, and I don't see any of the blue, the lines coming onto my property, but I got a letter, I guess, because I'm close enough.
Yeah, it may be useful for me to talk about how we generated that mailing list real quick. So to generate our mailing list, we took the existing floodplains and then buffered out a little bit on either side. So we probably have included some properties that don't currently have floodplain, may not have floodplain in the new study, but like you said, they're fairly close to the floodplain. So you may want to be knowledgeable about what's going on. Yeah. And then for the areas that currently don't have maps, we have stream buffers for water quality and erosion hazard purposes. And we took those and used those to identify the properties that would potentially be affected by the newly mapped areas. We may have cast the net a little wider than it ultimately needs to be, but everybody that got the mail out should be fairly close at least to a creek. So we wanted you to at least be aware of what was going on, even if it may or may not ultimately impact you.
Okay. And then going to sell a house, they would go on here and look at these maps, the current ones until they're updated to see. Yes. It would be listed if it was in a floodplain, I think. I have to get familiar with it. Okay. Thank you.
What website will ultimately provide updates on mitigation plans and flood reduction along Onion Creek. So the big flood mitigation project along Onion Creek has been buyouts lately. The previous study also included a feasibility analysis of various potential mitigation options. I think that's probably still available out there on the website somewhere, maybe not. The Rain to River strategic plan that Stephanie mentioned early on, there's maps associated with that show identified problem areas and potential projects and may ultimately have links to projects. The individual mitigation projects typically have their own public meetings and information mailers and things. Middle Williamson that we've been talking about just a few weeks back had a public meeting to talk about what they're proposing. So those are generally more project specific. I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on that one, Stephanie.
Yeah, if we have a flood mitigation or a flood risk reduction project in your area, generally we will also mail you information about that. And we often create a website that is specific for that project where we will post information about that specific project. That's once we're starting to actively work on the planning for the project that we create those. I guess there's a lot of resources out there on the website, depending on what exactly you're looking for. And sometimes that can make it confusing. The more there is, the harder it is sometimes to find. But yeah, we have, individual websites for various projects. The Rain to River website would be one where we might, once that project, that planning effort is done, would have the results of that planning effort and places where we might be proposing future projects as well.
Just wanted to mention, Mr. Coronado said in Spanish, if he covers the bridge because it is in his property, would that be okay?
If he were to want to put a bridge or culvert over the creek, there would need to be a a development permit associated with that, and it would have to be reviewed to ensure that there's no adverse flooding impacts on other properties. So there would likely need to be some form of site plan permitting process associated with that.
You said that he couldn't do any kind of mitigation because it was a private property.
I said the city wouldn't necessarily build a bridge on his private property. There is the possibility of the city doing a mitigation project. There would have to be easement acquisitions, things like that. If he were to want to do something to the creek himself, that would also require a site development permit application, and there would be environmental considerations.
Right. Okay.
Associated with that. Approximately how much elevation change would you expect in the floodplain edges, or is it too early to say? Generally, yes, it's too early. We did some very preliminary looks back when the Atlas 14 publication first came out, just to see on average what the changes might be in some watersheds. So it's going to depend very much on the nature of the terrain, wherever you are, which watershed you're in. For Shoal Creek and Boggy Creek, I think the increases were on the order of 1.5 feet, potentially. So that's a very, very general, don't take that as gospel ballpark of a couple of watersheds. But like I said, it will depend very much on the conditions local to the area in question.
And we also did have a question in the Q&A about where the most frequent flooding was in Austin.
Depends on where it rains the hardest, really. There is a lot of localized flooding. Onion Creek has been hit very hard by several floods in the recent past. Shoal Creek has previously been impacted significantly by floods. So there are a lot of potentially flood-prone areas in Austin. It depends on where the heavy rainfall falls. For example, Halloween 2015 flood and the Memorial Day 2016 flood. The heaviest rainfall by far was over on the southeast side near Bergstrom Airport. We got 13 plus inches of rain in 6 to 8 hours. It very much depends on where the heavy rain happens as to who will get the really severe flooding. The more frequent flooding can occur in a lot of different places.
I was looking at a house that's going up for sale on the market in my neighborhood. And so I just now looked it up on there, and it's a very long rectangular piece of property. And the back side of it has the blue and purple on it, but you can see the shed and the house are not in that purple zone. This insurance typically still, because part of your property is on there, even though the house and all that isn't shaded with those dark purple colors, require you to get flood insurance typically.
It's going to be more whether the actual structure is in the floodplain.
Oh, good to know. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's a lot of properties next to creeks that have some very significant elevation change. The house may be way above the creek, but the back end of the property goes down into the creek. So the property will be impacted. The houses very well may not be. Yeah. So I know we've had some questions on that in response to our mail outs. So just because your property is impacted may not mean your residents would be. And
will you have to ever prove that at all? So we're not doing the wrong thing if we think, well, we don't need to get flood insurance because of that. So if someone can, how do we protect ourselves?
Well, it'll depend on what the maps ultimately show. So if the floodplain line shows your structure in the floodplain, then you might have to there's what's called a letter of map amendment. So if you can show that your structure is really not in the floodplain, there's a fairly straightforward way to work directly with FEMA to do a letter of map amendment and get your home taken out of the floodplain. Hopefully you won't have to go down that road in the future.
Thank you.
And if you are concerned about flooding, I think we would say that flood insurance is probably the best way to protect yourself financially. So even if you're not strictly required to get it, you can go ahead and get a quote from your insurance agent so you can decide if that's something you want to do anyways. And I think we have also told people that a lender a mortgage lender can always decide to require flood insurance, even if, the federal government may not require it. The lender may decide that they want you to have it. So it is, they have a say in it too, I guess.
So can you explain how City of Austin, Travis County, Hayes County, LCRA, and groundwater organizations are accountable to the integrated water flows of Onion Creek? How do federal maps consider these administrative boundaries? How do you handle Onion Creek in the ETJ? The two main players in producing floodplain maps in the Onion Creek watershed are going to be the City of Austin and Hayes County. And both of us are going to be working with FEMA to ultimately produce the final flood insurance rate maps for that. And we certainly try to coordinate with all the players that might be involved in what goes into those studies, make sure we consider everything we need to consider. Ultimately, it's going to be the City of Austin and Hayes County that are producing the floodplain maps that will ultimately go to FEMA for the Onion Creek watershed. And Travis County will be certainly in the loop.
So the next question I have here is, does the lack of minor creek maintenance, keeping creeks clear of debris and overgrowth, and the lack of major creek maintenance, repairing eroded retaining walls, etc., impact the results of the survey studies? Do these factors impact results of hydrology, hydraulic inputs, and outputs of the computer models?
So what we do in our floodplain models, especially for the FEMA ones, is attempt to reflect the condition of the channel as it is now. So if it's somewhat overgrown, we're going to that's reflected in what's called a roughness coefficient in the hydraulic model. So we will reflect what's out there in our models. And does it have an impact? It can have somewhat of an impact. Then you get into the environmental considerations. Maintaining called riparian vegetation along the creeks is better from an environmental perspective. Ideally, when a creek channel is fully vegetated, you have some decent trees growing, and the small bushes and other things that would be more of a factor in clogging things up are minimized, but it takes a while to get to that state. There's a lot of factors that get balanced into how creeks get cleaned out. A lot of those are environmental. For smaller creeks, it may have a bigger impact. For something like Onion or Williamson, minor debris or brush isn't going to have that much of an impact. It seems a straightforward question, but it's never a straightforward answer, I'm afraid.
I just want to get our contact information up there for everybody. If you got the mail out, you should have all of this, but we are, happy to answer questions and talk with you one-on-one. A note on that phone number we call it a hotline, but you will be asked to leave a message and then we will call you back with that phone number. But you can also send us an email, and we're happy to talk with you if you have more questions. I do want to again say thank you to everyone for taking the time to come here this evening and listen to us.
We are in the process of updating the messages on that hotline number. There's 4 boxes that you can dump your message into when you call in there. So if you have questions resulting from this meeting, there's a box talks about Atlas 14. Go ahead and use that box. We will be changing that message as soon as we can to specifically talk about our floodplain studies. The box you want will either be the Atlas 14 one or one that talks specifically about floodplain studies once we do update that.
And I think we have been clear that this is a long process to remap the floodplains. So you probably won't hear a lot more from us until we have, those preliminary maps to show. We'll be doing a meeting similar to this for other areas of Austin. So you may get an email about that, but it will be this same general meeting just for people who haven't gotten that letter yet, north of the Onion Creek watersheds. But it may be a while before you hear from us again, but that's because we're working in the background on doing this. All right, everyone. Well, thank you all for coming, and we will, like I said, be in touch, but it will probably be a while. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.